one of these internal boards at Google where people can discuss things, which people at Google do all the time. So it was perfectly reasonable for him to post it because he didn't get a response from the diversity people. He thought, well, let's see what other people think. And then it was there for a long time until it was leaked into the outside world. It wasn't like Damore was trying to expose Google for what it is. He was just doing what an engineer type would do when someone asked him to provide feedback, because he's not thinking politically. He's not thinking, oh, they just want to hear what they already said. He thought they actually wanted some facts. Anyways, I think they picked on the wrong guy, because Damore turns out to be pretty damn tough.
Well, he's very smart and a very kind guy. Yeah. When you sit down and talk to him, he's not a sexist. He's a guy that's talking about facts. In fact, he wrote more than a page and a half, I believe, on strategies for getting more women interested in tech. He's not a sexist. Yeah. This is just a guy that was talking about the differences and the choices that people make that's based on just the variations that you were just discussing.
Yeah, well, there's a good study done a while ago, and unfortunately I don't remember the author, but they were looking at junior high math prodigies. And they're pretty equally distributed between boys and girls. But by the time university came along, the math prodigy boys, they tend to go into the STEM fields, but the girls wouldn't. And it isn't because they lacked ability, because they had stellar ability. It's because they weren't interested. And it turns out, like the interest thing turns out to be a big one. So with personality alone, if you measure men and women's personalities, and then you add up all the differences in personalities, you could tell with about 75 to 80% certainty by looking at a full personality readout whether a person's male or female. So you'd be wrong 25% of the time, something like that. But if you add interest to that, you can get it up to about 90%. And so, you say, well, are these differences large? Well, individually, they're not that big. They make more difference at the extremes. But if you add them up, then you can almost completely differentiate men from women. So by that token, they're very large. And the interest thing actually turns out to matter a lot. Like, it's probably the most important individual difference that has been discovered between men and women at the psychological level. And has real decent explanatory power, because you might say, well, men have a slight edge in spatial intelligence, and that's why they're overrepresented in STEM fields. And women have a slight edge in verbal intelligence. This is debatable, but literature kind of indicates that. And that's why they're overwhelmingly the majority of fiction readers, for example. Is that the reason that there's differential representation in the STEM fields? It's like, no, it doesn't seem to be. It doesn't look like it's an intellectual issue, which is also what Damore pointed out, by the way. He never said once that this was a cognitive issue. But it's a matter of choice, matter of interest. And women tend to be more people-oriented. Now, the thing is, this has also been discovered in chimpanzees and other primates. Like, if you offer baby or child chimpanzees, juvenile chimpanzees, the choice between thing-like toys, like cars, or people-like toys, like dolls, the males will go for the thing-like toys and the females will go for the people-like toys. So you see that in primates. And you think, well, is that surprising? It's like, well, no, it's not. It's not that surprising, really. I mean, women have to take care of infants, tiny infants. And you have to be really people-oriented to do that, because a tiny infant is an unbelievably demanding social relationship. And it's a primary relationship for about 2 years, and so women are tilted towards the kind of temperament that makes that possible. It's like, well, is that such a shock? Really? That's such a surprise? So,
no, yeah. It's not a surprise. And what's confusing to me is the narrative that anybody that points out these differences is somehow a sexist or discriminatory or worse.
Yeah. Well, whatever epithet they can. Well, I think the other reason that the radical lefties have been going after me constantly is, well, there's one reason is if you stand up against the radical left, you're in a group that also has Nazis in it, because the Nazis also stand up against the radical left. So it's perfectly reasonable from a strategic perspective for the radical leftists to say, well, you're against us. How do we know you're not a Nazi? It's like, well, statistically, I'm probably not. So there's that. But you could say at least the question is open. But then the next part of it comes is that it's motivated epithet slinging, because if I'm reasonable and I'm standing up against the radical left, and they admit that I'm reasonable, then there has to be an admission that reasonable people could stand up against the radical left, which kind of implies that the radical left isn't that reasonable. And so, well, they're not going to go there. Of course, they're not that reasonable. They're unreasonable beyond belief, as we saw in the situation with Lindsay Shepherd in Canada. So at Wilfrid Laurier University.
Let's talk about that real quick, because that was a fascinating thing too, and that also had to do with you. So she was discussing you in class, and you could fill in everybody with...
Yeah, she's in the communications department at Wilfrid Laurier, and they were talking about the role of language in communication, which is kind of what you would do in a communication class. And she decided to show a 5-minute clip from a program I had done for TV Ontario, which is a public television station, mainstream, left-leaning, liberal television station news program, and a good one. And I had been on there with a number of other people, including a Professor Nicholas Matt from the University of Toronto, who claimed essentially that there were no biological differences between men and women, and that had been the scientific consensus for the last 4 decades. So anyways, she showed a clip from this, and, well, she got hauled in front of 2 professors and an administrator, Adria Joel, who was basically hired for that purpose, and raked over the coals for daring to show this video. And she had the wherewithal to tape it. And then she made the tape public. And in that tape, they compared me. It was really blackly comical, you know. They compared me to Hitler. Yeah. But then said, well, it's Hitler or Milo Yiannopoulos. And I thought, you guys, you're so damn clueless, you can't even get your insults right. It's like, you can't say, that's like playing a video of Hitler or Milo Yiannopoulos. It's like, first of all, Hitler and Milo Yiannopoulos, they're actually not in the same category, right? Except that they're both human. That's about the narrowness of the category. And then Milo's like a comic provocateur, and you can hate him or love him or be indifferent. But to put him in the same category as Hitler just shows how muddle-headed you are. And then to assimilate me to that category so carelessly. Like, you don't mess about with epithets like that. You know, Hitler was one of the great supervillains of the 20th century, right? I mean, he's up there with Stalin and Mao in the panoply of satanically possessed leaders. You don't just toss that around, especially not when you're torturing your teaching assistant for daring to show a video about language in a communication class. And so that was a massive scandal in Canada. It was the biggest, I think it was the biggest scandal that ever hit a university in Canada. And it got a lot of international attention, and rightly so. And she also turns out to be a tough cookie. I mean, the last I heard, she'd started a club at Wilfrid Laurier, and I think it was last night or the night before, maybe it's coming up, they're going to show the whole video from Television Ontario at a club meeting and invite people to come and discuss it. It's like they picked on the wrong girl there too. So
they certainly did. She's obviously very smart. You could hear that in her discussion with them and how flabbergasted she was by their take on things. But this was essentially proof to a lot of people that were on the outside of how preposterous some of the dialogue was inside these universities. And
well, they couldn't have done me a bigger favor than having that scandal, because when I made videos about Bill C-16 15 months ago, I said, look, here's what's going to happen, because this legislation is written in an appalling manner and the surrounding policies are pathological. I said, here's what's going to happen. And so I laid it out. And then people came out and said, no, you're being paranoid. It's like, that's possible. No, the legislation isn't going to have that effect. No, you're not a legal expert. What the hell do you know? Et cetera, et cetera. You're crazy. You're a bigot. You're a transphobe. You know, they threw everything but the kitchen sink at me. And like, fair enough, you know, because there's always a possibility that I was wrong. But the problem was, is I read the policies and I understood them and I knew where they were leading. But I never imagined that one of the consequences of Bill C-16 and its sister legislation was that a teaching assistant at a Canadian university would be pilloried and accused of breaking the law, and then accused of all sorts of reprehensible political beliefs by 2 professors and an administrator hired for that purpose, merely because she showed a video about 2 people talking about the law. It's like that paranoid as I am, let's say, that exceeded the grasp or the reach of my imagination. And then, of course, it was made public and people just couldn't believe it. And then you think, okay, well, what's the defense? Well, they misinterpreted Bill C-16. It's like, no, I don't think so. They aren't representative of the university professor administration. Well, all of Pimlott and Rambukkana's colleagues rose to their defense, the whole department. The university, when they apologized, did it in a very mealy-mouthed way. Like, there's no evidence that it was an anomalous...